Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my next installment of my top 40 favorite albums of all time. I've been doing this show throughout January, so if this is your first time hearing about this series and this show, I would urge you to go check out episodes 1 and 2 that I've already done that talked about like the first 20 albums on the list. But now we're going to talk about albums 20 through 11. I've put up behind me on the wall some of the albums I've already talked about in this series, just to refresh you and give you an idea of my tastes and what I've been talking about. I'm much a fan of modern progressive rock. That's really my favorite genre of music, and I also love the classics as well in prog rock, so you're going to see more of those on this episode. A great list of 10 albums that I absolutely adore, obviously, and I'm just going to put them up and talk about them briefly, and hopefully you guys will appreciate the episode and talk about it in the comment section. So thank you guys for joining me on this series. I'm very appreciative of the comments I've received thus far. Seems like people are enjoying it. So let's get into the list with number 20. All right, first at number 20, I have Beardfish and their album Destin, Solitaire from 2009. This was actually one of the ones that rose the most on my list, because I had made a list like this, several years ago, and I basically used that as a starting point, listened to all the albums all over again, and kind of re-ranked them for this episode. And this one really rose up. I really appreciate what Beardfish did on this record. They're a band from Sweden doing an eclectic style of prog, influenced by like Zappa and Gentle Giant and all of the classic, prog bands. There's a bit of Yes and Genesis and all of that stuff. But what I really like about this record is them fully embracing that Gentle Giant influence, which are one of my favorite bands ever. And every track is strong. It's a pretty lengthy record. There's some big long tracks on it. Until You Comply is 15 minutes long, but it just keeps my interest throughout. There's some cool instrumental tracks. And I love Rickard's vocals throughout. He has some impassioned vocal moments, and I just love the playing and the quirkiness and the fun. I love music where you could tell the band is having fun creating the music, and it has that kind of sense of humor and doesn't take itself too seriously, but is really complex and really well crafted and well made. And that's what I hear on this record. So really incredible entry into their discography. There's so many great Beardfish records. Sleeping in Traffic parts 1 and 2 are probably ones that I point you to if you want to get into the band, as well as this one. But I'm glad that they're back. They kind of disbanded for a while, but have returned with a recent record. But this one will always stay in my heart as one of my favorites. This was the album that really solidified them as one of my top tier favorite bands in prog. Next, I've got more of a classic record here. I had to include this somewhere on the list. And remember, the ranking itself is somewhat arbitrary. It's just depending on my mood when I listen to these records and put them in some kind of arbitrary order, but this could all shift around. But this is Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick from 1972, prog folk music from the UK. One of the classics of the genre. I think many people would consider this one of the top 3 or 4, prog records of all time, and for good reason. It's kind of the, basically Ian Anderson was making fun of concept records, but came out with one of the best ones to ever exist. A lot of people considered his previous record, Aqualung, to be a concept record, and he didn't like that. It wasn't really intended as a concept record, so he decided to make his own shot at a concept record, and it has great humor to it. It's just goes at a really cool pace. It's really fast and never lets up and just has so many wonderful moments. I like how it's recorded. It just sounds so pristine, like how that acoustic guitar comes in at the beginning, and then when the band kicks in, it just has that weight and power to it. It has folky moments. It has full-blown prog. It has a big anthemic, epic ending. I love Ian Anderson's vocals throughout the piece. He has some really biting, interesting lyrics like he always does. And I'm a sucker for a concept record, as you'll see throughout this whole list. Almost every album I'm talking about from this point out forward is a concept record in some manner. I just love how things connect and how these themes kind of replay later in the record, and how everything just is so well connected. And it's just one long song that takes the course of 43, 44 minutes. And it's all brilliant. And I've always loved it and thought it was excellent. My dad is the one who introduced me to classic prog. Jethro Tull isn't really one of his big bands that he talks about. He's much more into Yes and Genesis and Gentle Giant. But he loves this record. This is one that he shared as like kind of an exception of an album that he loves, even though he's not a big Jethro Tull guy. So that shows how wide-reaching this record is and how it can touch prog fans, even ones who aren't fully immersed in the world of Jethro Tull. So fantastic record at number 19. Next, I've got Porcupine Tree and the album In Absentia from 2002, heavy prog from the UK. This really was a groundbreaking record when I heard it. You know, I was, as I've been discussing throughout these episodes, my dad introduced me to classic prog, but I was already into like modern alternative rock music and metal music. I actually had already heard and liked bands like Tull, you know, also bands like Incubus and, you know, even Nickelback and Linkin Park and those kinds of bands from the early 2000s. You know, I was young, I was a teenager, so I liked that kind of music. But I was searching for stuff that was more modern but had that kind of classic progressive sound to it. And when I first heard Porcupine Tree and this record, I believe I just picked it up because it was so well regarded, and I just bought it in the record store without even hearing a note of it. When I first heard Blackest Eyes, I was just blown away because it took some of those sounds from the classic, you know, era of prog that I was starting to love from the stuff my dad was showing me, but brought it into the modern era. It had great modern production values, had a heavier, almost metallic kind of bent to it. But didn't sacrifice beautiful, sumptuous melodies and gorgeous sounds. Steven Wilson is one of my favorite songwriters, and so many of these songs just stick to my memory and, you know, are some of my favorites that I've ever heard. And I love the thematic element. Once again, it's somewhat of a concept record. I believe it's about, like, you know, disturbed individuals, kind of serial killers, and, you know, kind of delving into the psychology of certain, like, more nefarious types. So it's kind of interesting, even though it's such a dark concept, it's very beautiful, and there's so many like moments of pure beauty and joy throughout the record that I just love and continue to listen to this day. So it was a great marriage of my two loves at the time of music, of the classic prog and rock and the more modern alternative and metal, and it all kind of came together in this brilliant record that I still love to this day. I'm a fan of their whole discography. I know other people might put up like Fear of a Blank Planet as a little bit better than this one, or even Dead Wing, you know, and I love those records as well, but because of the, you know, the meaning behind this record and what it meant when I discovered it and my personal connection to it, I just had to sneak this up high on my list. So at number 18, Porcupine Tree and Absentia. At number 17, I've got The Deer Hunter and Act 5, Hymns with the Devil and Confessional from 2016. Casey Crescenzo, his project here. And it's not like purely progressive rock in the traditional sense, but it definitely has prog elements. Once I heard The Deer Hunter with Act 3, that was really my introduction with the group. I was pretty much obsessed with the band and their kind of styles, how they brought a lot of different influences from like Beach Boys to Beatles to like vaudevillian music to more modern rock, just all over the spectrum, some 70s sounds, and brought it together into these excellent concept records, this overarching story between multiple acts. And to me, as you'll see soon in the list, Acts 4 and 5 are really where it solidified and became something special. And Act 5, even though it's maybe a little bit darker, a little bit more moody compared to Act 4, which I also love, it's just so beautiful. There's so many great moments. Every song has something cool to it. There's still some quirky, interesting, different kinds of styles being played with, like on Mr. Usher, having that kind of classic throwback 30s kind of style to it. The Revival has a kind of a cool sound to it as well. That's a throwback vaudevillian thing. But you have some just really beautiful rock songs and songs that really catch my heart and just have excellent melodies that stand out to me. I love the end of the record that, you know, has kind of this epic feel. But it's just a really great record through so many different lovely styles of music and just great songwriting and a cool story that's unique and interesting. I just love the Deer Hunter and their whole aesthetic. I think they're one of the best bands that exists in today's modern landscape, and I wish more people knew about this band. I think they could appeal to a large swath of people, not just prog fans, but, you know, rock fans in general. I think they really capture a lot of interesting cross sections from the world of music that a lot of people could fall in love with. But here it is, Act 5, Hymns with the Devil in Confessional. Absolutely brilliant. At number 16, another classic record here. This is Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974, Symphonic Prague from the UK. Of course, once again, I talked about how I love concept records, so that's why this one always stood out to me as a favorite. And I know it sometimes can have a bit of mixed opinions. Some people think maybe it's not as consistent, maybe the second half isn't as strong as the first half, or doesn't end with as epic a moment as people would hope. But when I first heard this record, I was just so blown away and in love with it right off the bat, because I loved the idea that an album could tell a story, that it could have this narrative that takes you on a journey. Even though the story itself is a little bit nonsensical and kind of strange and bizarre, I just love the concept that music can tell a story. And I love so many tracks on here. There's so many prominent moments that stick with me and have beauty and fun and just really expressive, expansive music. Peter Gabriel really showcases his whole skills here on this record. He just has such immense talent, but the band backs it up very excellently. And there's so many highlights, it's hard to point out what my favorite tracks are. Fly on a Windshield is such a powerful moment right at the beginning. You've got In the Cage, which has always been a favorite. Back in New York City is another fun proggier song. I've always liked Carpet Crawlers and Chamber of 32 Doors. I think it ends the first half just expertly well. But there's so many great tracks on the second half with Lily White Lilith, Anyway, Supernatural Anesthesis, The Colony of Slipperman, Lamia. There's so many beautiful, brilliant moments. It's just a fun ride. And even though there's moments that maybe don't click 100%, to me, those moments are important because it creates this quirky story. Like The Waiting Room isn't really my favorite piece of music to listen to, but it fits within the theme of the record. It makes sense within the storyline. Even though I would never listen to that song out of context of the record, I think those little quirky, kind of interesting little moments make the experience that much better. So The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, a classic. It inspired so many of my favorite concept records that have come after it, as you'll see soon. And I just adore it. I think it has so much character and so much interesting elements, and it never lets up, and every moment has something that, is unique and interesting. So love it. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway at number 16. Now, talking about concept albums that were inspired by the Lamb, I've got at number 15, Spock's Beard's Snow. And this is from 2002, Symphonic Prague from the US, the work of Neal Morse, who I talk about frequently on the channel. When I was getting into Spock's Beard, this was the most current record that existed. And I basically listened to all the records leading up to it first and ended with this record. And I loved it at first listen. I love the concept. Once again, I love concept records, how they tell a story, how the songs are interconnected and bleed one from the next. And there's so many memorable moments. I like that it's right next to The Lamb, because I feel very similarly to this record as I do The Lamb. It has a narrative arc and has so many quirky, interesting songs. Maybe you could argue the second half isn't as strong as the first half, but I still think there's a lot of quirky, cool material that stands up to this day and makes for a complete, cool ride of music. It's lengthy. It takes a long time to get through it all, but the journey is worth it for me. And, it was a little bit heartbreaking when I discovered this record. I was so excited about it. And then Spock's Beard broke up after that. They didn't break up, but Neal Morse left the band, which was, their main songwriter and their frontman. So I knew the sound was going to change dramatically. So that was a bit of a bummer, but luckily they went off on their own paths and still crafted great music. Both Neal Morse as a solo artist and Spock's Beard without Neal Morse. So it wasn't a total tragedy like I thought it was, but this record always stood out to me as something extremely special. I love every moment of it. I love the overtures. I love, these kind of quirky songs like Devil's Got My Throat and, Welcome to New York City, which has a funky angle to it. I just love every moment, and I think it's a fun journey and a fun story, and it kind of is the first glimpse of Neal Morse's concept records. After this record, he would craft like 4 big concept records in a row that I absolutely adore, and I think this kind of provided the blueprint for that and showcased a somewhat spiritual story that he shows why Neal Morse left Spock's Beard at the time, that he was probably relating a lot to the character of Snow and his like spiritual journey. So a great record. I absolutely love this one. And it just has so much energy and pep from the band that it's infectious and fun and catchy, and I love it. So Spock's Feared Snow at number 15. All right, next at number 14, I've got Steven Wilson and Hand Cannot Erase from 2015. And I've talked a bit about Steven Wilson already. He was the main man in Porcupine Tree, the main writer. So I talked about it within Absentia. I also put The Raven That Refused to Sing on the list on a previous episode. But to me, this is kind of the peak and pinnacle of Steven Wilson's solo work. Beautiful, melancholy, depressing concept that this record is about. This sad story based on the life of Joyce Carol Vincent, who was found dead in her apartment and had been there dead for almost 3 years without anyone finding her. It's really dark. It's about loneliness. It's about, depression and sadness and all of these kind of darker emotions. But there's a beauty behind it as well. That's what I love about Steven Wilson's writing, is that he's talking about these dark, subject matters, but does it in a way that's melodically satisfying and beautiful to listen to, and brings kind of the hidden depth into these darker subjects. And there's so many great moments. This is, an all-star group of musicians playing on this record, much like The Raven. But I feel like it brings in a bit more of a modern angle to it, whereas The Raven was like a throwback 70s album that really played homage to its influences. This one still has a lot of those influences, but I feel like it brings some modern moments, some Porcupine Tree-esque sounds, and creates a more true to Steven Wilson experience that showcases a lot of his eclectic tastes, not just his 70s prog love. So, and there's so many great moments, once again, 3 Years Older is one of my favorite tracks. It starts the record really well with this kind of fast-paced sound. I love Routine is beautiful, Home Invasion. You've got Ancestral, which to me has one of the greatest, prog moments towards the end, where it just ramps up and up with these incredible heights, playing faster and faster as it goes. And you've got the talents of Guthrie Govan, Adam Holzman, Dave Gregory, Theo Travis, Nick Beggs, Marco Miniman. You've just got so many great players on this record, and it shows. It's just an incredible concept that hangs well together, not a moment wasted, and it's beautiful from start to finish. And I love the juxtaposition. My two favorite artists are probably Neal Morse and Steven Wilson, and to me, you couldn't find two people more different. Neal Morse is very much about positivity, and every album has to have this uplifting conclusion and positivity and the spiritual message, where Steven Wilson's more of an atheist and more talking about darker, more melancholy subjects, and the music reflects that a lot more. But they're both brilliant songwriters, and I love having the two sides to my taste and being able to experience and enjoy both to provide that variety. I think that's important in music, is finding variety and different things instead of just listening to all the same thing all the time. All right, at number 13, we're going back to the Deer Hunter. I already talked about Act 5, but here at number 13 is the Deer Hunter's Act 4, a rebirth and reprise from 2015. And much like what I said for that, for Act 5 applies here as well. But I find this to be just a little bit stronger. It's very close. They're both like fantastic records that I almost view as like a duology together. But this one's a little bit brighter, a little bit more fun, a little bit more varied. And I love it for that. There's so many cool sections, so many different style songs, and there's just such sumptuous beauty. There's some orchestration. There's moments where, you get kind of like a disco theme song with King of Swords, but then you also get these like really beautiful ballads and vocals, like in Is There Anybody Here? It just runs the gamut between so many different things, but somehow still feels cohesive as a whole, telling this singular story. And once again, like I said with Act 5, Deer Hunter deserves to be one of the biggest bands in rock music. They just are incredible at what they do, and have great melodies and great musical instincts, and Casey is just one of my favorite songwriters that's active today. I think he's brilliant, and this album showcases it. It's one of the peaks of the whole Act series to me, and was when the band really came into their own and just beefed it up to a whole nother level. They were already great. The first 3 acts are already brilliant on their own, but this to me like lifted it up to new heights into the stratosphere, and they've subsequently become one of my top 5 favorite bands from it. So love the Deer Hunter, love this record, and I love it even more re-listening to it this week. Maybe it should have been even higher, but here it sits at number 13. All right, back to my love of Neal Morse. We've got Sola Scriptura at number 12 from 2007. This is one of the records he released as a solo artist after he left Spock's Beard, kind of a string of great classic solo albums that are concept records. And this talks about the story of Martin Luther, maybe a bit controversial at the time for some people, but musically it's just a powerhouse. It's one of the heavier albums that Neal has done. It starts out with this really cool prog metal kind of intro that repeats throughout the piece of music. There's some great sections. It just morphs and weaves through all of the different styles that Neal Morse is known for, from heavier moments to lighter moments to more sing-along choruses, to some excellent guitar solos like at the end of The Door. The conflict begins with this heavy metal opening, but by the middle of the song it's morphed into like this Spanish guitar moment that's like Senior Velasco point 2. I just love this whole record. It just never stops. It's relentless. It's fun. And talking about a very interesting historical story that, you don't hear often in music. So, and it has one of Neal's best concluding parts. The conclusion, the last song, brings back all the moments from throughout the record in expert fashion and has this epic, awesome conclusion. And, it's only 4 tracks. And 3 of them essentially are epics, and then there's Heaven in My Heart, which provides a cool breather between tracks 2 and 4. So a fantastic piece of music, the height of Neal's creative powers, a brilliant release from start to finish that, I was blown away with when I first listened to it. And in some moments, it's kind of bandied about for, is this my favorite of Neal Morse's solo records? I think there's some other contenders, as you'll see later in the list, but it's brilliant, and I absolutely adore it, and it's just fun to listen to, and is a perfect description of the style of music that really captures me and interests me. So Sola Scriptura by Neal Morse at number 12. And for the last record of today, I had to include something from the Flower Kings, and so here it is. It's The Sum of No Evil from 2007 at number 11 here. A great symphonic prog from Sweden. They're one of my favorite all-time bands. Really, it's probably Spock's Beard and Flower Kings. Those were the 2 bands that I fell in love with when I was exploring modern prog, and they still stand as 2 of my all-time favorite bands today. I love Roine Stolt and his songwriting craft, and just how much they pay homage to the classic 70s prog. They have a lot of influence from, like, of course, Yes, and a little bit of Genesis and Jethro Tull and all of those other bands that I absolutely adore come to fruition. But this record is the one I chose because I feel like it's the most consistent. You could argue that a lot of their records are a little bit lengthy. They have a lot of double albums and albums that really take over the whole length of a CD, 80 minutes long. So a lot of people argue that there's filler here and there, songs that don't quite work as well as others in their catalog and discography. But to me, this is a single disc record. It's fairly compact, at least for them, even though there's still 3 different epics on this in various ways. But I don't know, this just has a consistency to it that I've always fallen in love with, and I just was really impressed with it when it first came out. It came out when I was in college, and I just absolutely was obsessed with it. In fact, one of the funniest stories is I had it pre-ordered. I was ordering it from online to be able to get my copy, but it wasn't going to be at my apartment by release date, so I actually drove out to the record store and bought a copy of it on release day so that I could listen to it, even though I knew it was coming in the mail in the next couple days, because I loved it that much. But it allowed me to be able to have the regular edition and the special edition, so I guess that works out. But it's just such a brilliant record. It was in my CD player in my car for probably months. I was just so obsessed with it at the time. I think the opening track of One More Time is just a perfect opener with all the classic elements of Flower Kings at play. Love is the Only Answer is one of my favorite Flower Kings epics, going through so many different things throughout the run of the album. Some of No Reason is such a fun kind of experimental, darker track, but it's interesting. They have a great instrumental on here, and then Life in Motion closes this in a beautiful, sumptuous, symphonic way. I just think it's one of the strongest front-to-back releases from the band, and I had to represent them on my list. I always come back to it. If I'm ever wanting to listen to Flower Kings, this is the top choice of what I want to listen to from them. And I feel like it wasn't as highly regarded at the time as it should have been. Like, I feel like the band were a little bit disappointed in the reception of this album back when it came out. But I think people have warmed up to it over time, and I know a lot of my contemporaries also view this as one of their best records in their discography, and for good reason. So, number 11, I have to have the Flower Kings on my list, and to me this is like a great representation of who they are and their sound that I've come to grow to love so much. So there you have it, another 10 records, and only 10 left to go. The top 10 in next week's episode. Hopefully you've been enjoying the series, and these are all records I absolutely love. It was hard to order them. Some of these, even as I'm talking about them, I'm like, oh, should that have gone up higher in the list, or is that a little bit too high perhaps? But you know, I don't think it really matters where they show up on the list here. I think what matters is just sharing music that has meant a lot to me, and maybe there'll be a record or two here that you hadn't heard of that you'll go check out and love, or maybe you'll just be able to gush about how great these records are with me, and share your opinions in the comments section. So that's great too. So thank you guys for joining me. Hopefully you're appreciating these episodes. One last one next week, the top 10. It'll be a fun episode, and then we'll go back to regularly scheduled programming. So thank you guys, and I'll catch you guys in a future episode. Bye everybody. Enjoy the music.